Imagine waking up to discover that the closest ally your country has trusted for more than a century has suddenly launched an economic attack against you. No warning, no negotiation, just a sudden decision that could shake the foundations of the North American economy. That is exactly what unfolded in the last 48 hours between the United States and Canada, two nations whose economies, security structures, and political futures have been intertwined for generations. And at the center of this unfolding geopolitical drama is a decision made in Washington that few analysts believed would ever be used against one of America's closest allies. In a move that stunned trade experts, investors, and political leaders around the world, the administration of former U.S. President Donald Trump invoked a powerful and controversial instrument in American trade law known as Section 301. For most viewers, that phrase might sound technical and distant, something buried deep inside the complicated machinery of international trade policy. But the consequences of that single decision could be enormous. Section 301 gives the U.S. President sweeping authority to investigate and retaliate against what the administration considers unfair trade practices by foreign countries. Unlike many other tools of economic diplomacy, it allows the president to act unilaterally. That means without waiting for Congress, without relying on international arbitration, and often without the slow, careful diplomatic negotiations that normally characterize trade disputes between allied nations. In effect, it gives the White House the power to impose massive tariffs or economic penalties almost immediately. When Trump's administration used this tool against Canada, it was not simply another policy disagreement between neighbors. It was a signal that the economic relationship between the two countries had entered dangerous territory. The investigation targeted several Canadian policies that the administration claimed were harmful to American businesses. These included Canada's digital services taxes affecting large technology companies, its long-standing dairy supply management system designed to protect Canadian farmers, and even certain environmental regulations that American officials argued placed U.S. companies at a disadvantage. On the surface, those disputes may sound familiar. Trade disagreements over agriculture, manufacturing standards, and taxes have existed between the United States and Canada for decades. Usually, they are resolved through negotiations, arbitration panels, or agreements such as the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade framework that replaced NAFTA. But invoking Section 301 changed the tone completely. The investigation alone created the possibility that the United States could impose tariffs as high as 60% on a wide range of Canadian exports. Lumber, aluminum, automobiles, energy products, and industrial materials could suddenly face massive barriers entering the American market. For a country like Canada, whose economy is deeply connected to trade with the United States, that kind of action could have immediate consequences for jobs, investment, and economic stability. Yet the real shock was not only the investigation itself, but the broader strategy surrounding it. Reports quickly emerged that the administration was also preparing additional economic pressure measures. These included potential restrictions on certain Canadian assets held in American financial institutions, visa limitations affecting Canadian business leaders operating in sectors under investigation, and warnings that American companies could face consequences if they continued working with firms deemed non-compliant under new trade rules. For many analysts, the combination of these policies looked less like a typical trade disagreement and more like a deliberate attempt to apply overwhelming economic pressure on a neighboring ally. Some commentators described it bluntly as economic warfare. But what happened next is what transformed the story from a diplomatic dispute into a geopolitical drama that captured global attention. Canada's response came quickly, and it was far more assertive than many observers expected. Within hours of the announcement, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney appeared on national television to address the country directly. His speech was calm but unmistakably firm. He declared that Canada would not be bullied, would not accept threats, and would not allow political theater in Washington to undermine the livelihoods of Canadian workers. For a country whose foreign policy has traditionally emphasized diplomacy and stability in its relationship with the United States, the tone was striking. But the real significance of Carney's message came when he outlined Canada's potential countermeasures. Instead of focusing solely on defending Canadian exports, he invoked the possibility of using Canada's own strategic advantages. Through a rarely used legal framework known as the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, the Canadian government signaled that it could designate key sectors of the national economy as protected infrastructure. That designation would allow the government to review, restrict, or redirect resources considered essential to national security. The list of sectors included in the announcement immediately captured attention in Washington. Canadian energy exports to the United States were placed under potential review. Strategic minerals vital to semiconductor manufacturing and advanced electronics were included as well. Water resources connected to the Great Lakes system were mentioned, along with Canadian airspace and transportation corridors used by American airlines traveling between the United States, Europe, and Asia. At first glance, these may seem like technical policy areas, but in reality, they represent enormous leverage. Canada supplies roughly 4 million barrels of oil per day to the United States, accounting for a significant share of American imports. Many northern states rely heavily on Canadian energy to heat homes, power factories, and sustain transportation systems. If those supplies were disrupted even partially, the effects could ripple across regional economies almost immediately. Oil markets reacted quickly to the possibility. Prices rose sharply as traders began calculating what restrictions on Canadian energy could mean for supply chains across North America. Energy was only one part of the equation. Canada is also a major supplier of critical minerals used in modern technology, including lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. These materials are essential for batteries, electronics, renewable energy systems, and advanced military equipment. American manufacturers depend on stable supplies of these resources to maintain production. If export permits were restricted or redirected toward alternative markets, American industries ranging from automotive manufacturing to defense contracting could face serious disruptions. Analysts began warning that the dispute was no longer simply about trade balances or agricultural policy. It had evolved into a confrontation with potential implications for national security and technological competition. The stakes were rising rapidly, and financial markets responded accordingly. Within hours of the announcements from Washington and Ottawa, major stock indexes began fluctuating as investors assessed the risks. Energy companies, airlines, manufacturing firms, and banks all experienced volatility. Airlines were particularly concerned because potential changes to Canadian airspace agreements could force longer flight routes for many transatlantic and transpacific journeys. Flights that currently pass efficiently through Canadian skies might have to detour hundreds of miles, increasing fuel costs and travel times. The aviation industry warned that even minor restrictions could cost billions of dollars annually. Meanwhile, manufacturing companies began examining supply chains that crossed the border multiple times during production. A car assembled in the United States might contain parts manufactured in Canada, which themselves depend on raw materials imported from other countries. Interrupting that network could halt production lines almost overnight. The political implications inside the United States also began emerging quickly. Several American states depend heavily on trade with Canada. Michigan alone conducts over $100 billion in annual commerce with its northern neighbor. Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania also maintain deep economic ties through agriculture, manufacturing, and energy infrastructure. When the possibility of tariffs and supply disruptions became clear, governors and business leaders in these states began expressing concern. Factories rely on cross border shipments of components. Farmers depend on fertilizers connected to Canadian mineral supplies. Energy systems rely on pipelines transporting Canadian oil and natural gas. In many communities, the economic relationship between the two countries is not an abstract policy debate, but a daily reality that supports jobs and local industries. As a result, political pressure began building in Washington from constituencies worried about the consequences of escalating the conflict. While domestic tensions grew, something equally important was happening on the global stage. Governments around the world were watching carefully. For decades, the United States has served as the central hub of the global economic system. Allies built supply chains around access to American markets, and international agreements assumed a degree of stability in U.S. trade policy. But when Washington launched aggressive economic measures against Canada, it raised a troubling question for other countries. If America could treat one of its closest allies this way, what did that mean for everyone else? That uncertainty prompted discussions in capitals across Europe and Asia about diversifying economic relationships and reducing dependence on any single partner. Canada itself began exploring new trade opportunities, accelerating discussions with European and Asian partners interested in energy imports and critical mineral supply chains. Prime Minister Carney reportedly held conversations with leaders across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, emphasizing Canada's willingness to expand partnerships beyond North America if necessary. These discussions were not necessarily about replacing the United States, but about creating alternative options. For Canada, diversification offered strategic security in an era where economic pressure could be used as a geopolitical weapon. For other countries, cooperating with Canada provided access to resources and stability at a time when global supply chains were already under strain. The possibility of new alliances and trade routes added another layer of complexity to the conflict, transforming it from a bilateral dispute into an issue with global implications. Inside Washington, policymakers faced a difficult strategic dilemma. Backing down too quickly could appear politically weak, particularly after framing the action as necessary to defend American economic interests. But escalating the confrontation risked damaging industries and relationships that had taken decades to build. Trade disputes between allies can sometimes spiral when both sides feel pressure to demonstrate strength. History offers many examples of conflicts that expanded beyond their original causes because leaders found it difficult to retreat without losing political credibility. In this case, both the United States and Canada had strong domestic reasons to stand firm. Trump's political messaging had long emphasized toughness on trade and protecting American industries from foreign competition. Carney, meanwhile, needed to demonstrate that Canada would defend its sovereignty and economic interests against external pressure. For ordinary citizens on both sides of the border, the potential consequences were becoming increasingly tangible. Higher energy prices, more expensive goods, disrupted supply chains, and economic uncertainty could affect households within weeks if tariffs and countermeasures took effect. Businesses that rely on predictable cross-border trade faced difficult decisions about investment and hiring. Airlines calculated new routes and fuel costs. Manufacturers reviewed inventories of critical components. Financial markets continued to monitor developments closely, aware that prolonged instability between two of the world's most integrated economies could ripple through the global financial system. Beyond the immediate economic impact, the crisis raised deeper questions about the future of international alliances. The United States and Canada share more than a trade relationship. Their militaries cooperate through NORAD, jointly monitoring North American airspace. Intelligence agencies exchange information. Infrastructure projects connect their transportation and energy networks. A breakdown in trust between the two countries could influence defense planning, diplomatic coordination, and strategic decision making across the Western alliance. Even if the immediate dispute eventually cooled, the memory of it could shape future policy discussions in both capitals. Canadian leaders might accelerate efforts to diversify trade and reduce economic dependence on a single partner. American policymakers might reconsider the risks of using aggressive trade tools against close allies whose cooperation remains essential in other areas. Ultimately, the confrontation between Washington and Ottawa illustrates how quickly geopolitical dynamics can shift in a highly interconnected world. A decision intended to address trade grievances can trigger cascading reactions across markets, industries, and diplomatic relationships. Energy flows, mineral supplies, transportation networks, and financial systems are all intertwined in ways that make modern economies both powerful and fragile. When political conflict enters that network, the consequences extend far beyond the original dispute. For now, the situation remains fluid. Negotiations could resume, tensions could ease, and both sides could eventually find a compromise that allows them to declare victory while restoring stability. But it is equally possible that this moment will be remembered as a turning point, a moment when one of the world's most stable economic partnerships faced a profound test. History often reveals itself not through dramatic declarations, but through a series of decisions whose full impact becomes clear only later. Whether this confrontation fades into another chapter of diplomatic tension or evolves into something more significant will depend on the choices made in the coming weeks. What is certain is that the relationship between the United States and Canada, once considered one of the most predictable alliances in global politics, has entered a period of uncertainty, and the outcome of this crisis may shape the economic and strategic landscape of North America for years to come.